So hi everyone, and welcome to the first of the Anthropology in the Professional World seminars of this calendar year. And so I'm really delighted that today we've got Jennifer Cairns coming to talk to us about her many different hats that she's wearing, both kind of during and since she finished her PhD. So Jenny was a PhD student here in the Anthropology department. When did you finish last? Yeah,
I did. My Viva was 2 days into the first lockdown, and okay. I still have not had that pint. So
annoying. These are the things that we're missing. But I'm not going to really say much about Jenny, because the whole point of the seminar is for her to talk about herself and the things that she's been doing and how she's been using anthropology. And I think she's been doing some really interesting things that will be of interest to lots of different people who have different ideas about what they want to do with anthropology after you've finished studying. So Jenny, I will hand over to you and let you introduce yourself and talk about your work.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah, for inviting me to be the first in your seminar series. So I have not done any slides. My ego is not quite large enough to prepare slides about myself. So I thought I would just try and give a bit of an introduction into kind of the various things that I do, and then I would love for this to be a bit more of a conversation. And I don't really know, I don't think I know anybody else on the call. So sorry if I should know you all, but I'm sure you have your own interests. So I would love to be able to steer the conversation more according to the audience. So I'm going to need some help for that, because I don't know who is listening. So my name is Jenny, and I kind of juggle quite a few different professional hats. So as Hannah mentioned, I think first and foremost, I consider myself an anthropologist. I finished my PhD a year ago and I'm looking at some postdoc projects now and have been doing academic research ever since. But I'm also a UX researcher. So UX stands for user experience. And so for the anthropologists in the room, that's essentially applied anthropology. And I apply that research currently into a private sector setting. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I'm also a classical singer, which I'm not planning on talking about at all. I doubt that will be relevant to anybody on the call. If there are any classical musicians here, I'd be very happy to talk about it, but I'm going to assume that there are not. What was the other thing that I do? Oh yeah, and I'm a fellow in public anthropology for the Royal Anthropological Institute with my friend and colleague Laura Haapio-Kirk, I should mention. So that's a shared position, but she is in the very final stages of completing her PhD thesis. So for the sake of her sanity, I will kind of cover any questions about that. So I will just quickly kind of summarize what the RAI, the Royal Anthropological Institute stuff is, and then I probably will talk a little bit more about UX, which I'm kind of assuming it's going to be a bit more relevant to some of the people here, but again, that I'm happy to be told that's wrong. So for those of you that don't know the RAI, the Royal Anthropological Institute is like the professional body of anthropologists in the UK, Great Britain and Ireland. And about a year and a half ago, to quote them exactly, what they said was that they wanted a David Attenborough of anthropology. Now, I do not claim for a second to have delivered on that at all, but they wanted a greater sort of public face for a lot of the work that anthropologists do. And this is something that both Laura and I feel really passionate about. I think central to anthropology is people, and I've always found it I suppose challenging, that ethically challenging, actually kind of morally challenging, that so little of our work ends up feeding back to both the people we're doing research on and about and with, and then also the wider public. And I don't know how many other people in the digital room have had this experience of just saying, oh, I'm an anthropologist, and then just being met with a completely blank face, which is very frustrating, because it's actually something that is fundamentally important and I think interesting to a huge number of people, but is not so well known perhaps as saying, oh, I'm an economist or I'm a historian. So the RAI wanted to make appointments of, it ended up being 2 of us, to organize a bunch of events to try and sort of evangelize about anthropology a little bit and get anthropological research into the public eye more. And Laura and I organized a bunch of different events. and then they all got cancelled because of COVID. And so then we organised a load more events, which also then got cancelled. And then eventually we came up with some virtual stuff. So we've run an exhibition of illustrated anthropology. We've been trying to profile a lot of research that's been happening that's often sort of visual or even kind of co-designed with research participants. And there's not an easy home for that in some academic outputs. I think a lot of academics have a lot of other stuff they gather in the field that doesn't end up having a home. And so we tried to organize an exhibition around some of that. And then the other major output has been a podcast series, which has also resulted in a bit of broadcasting work with the BBC on Radio 3, which has all been about profiling really socially important work that lots of anthropologists are doing that somehow doesn't end up being picked up by the public quite so much, and yet is about kind of major current issues. So that's the work that I've been doing for the RAI. And then I'll just say a few words about what UX is, in case people on the call don't know, and then for people that do know, maybe how that kind of, in my mind at least, sits with anthropology. So UX research, or user experience research, is all about trying to understand the end user of a service, or it might be of a policy, or it could be of a product. And that will depend on the setting. So I came to UX research because after my master's, which was in anthropology a couple of years ago, I knew I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't know what the topic was. I had no idea. And I decided I need to go off and do something else for a while to work out what the PhD topic should be. And so I moved to London and was floating around trying to earn a living as a singer. And then I ended up going into the civil service fast stream is what it's called. And for those that are not ingrained in the kind of UK civil service system, it's essentially a sort of graduate scheme where you get experience in the diplomatic service and various other government departments. And while I was there, I ended up being put into a researcher position, which was doing research into implementing policies. And there's a fundamental tension that I think a lot of people find when they go and work in central government, which is that you have all these people designing policies and they have no exposure to the people that the policies will affect. And so I was working in the Department of Health, and we were looking, for example, one example was we were looking at policies to do with women who are victims of FGM. And we were trying to understand how we could better provide healthcare to them. And yet none of the people in the department had actually gone and spoken with some of these people and understood the actual context with which they were seeking healthcare support. It turned out many of them were taken to appointments by their husband, and it was all being translated through a translator. And so there were all sorts of issues there that were not being understood well by the policymakers. That's one example. I also, when I was there, got to do some research in the prison system, which was incredibly interesting, and all these sort of scenarios that you don't normally get to go into. And so while I was there, I became really interested in user-centered design, is what UX designers and researchers would call it, and anthropologists would call it ethnography. And a big part of what I learned in the government is that I think these different slightly siloed worlds have different names for these things, but there's a huge amount of overlapping skills. And I think if I could say there's one ability that I think really helps to navigate these worlds in parallel, it's the ability to say essentially the same thing to different audiences and to translate that. And I'll try and talk about that again a little bit in a minute if I remember. If not, Hannah, you can remind me. So I worked in government for a little while in various different departments. I ended up getting posted overseas, doing some work for the Foreign Office, doing some kind of security requirements gathering, which was actually very boring. It sounds exciting, it really wasn't. So I won't go into huge detail about that. And then I ended up consulting. And so I ended up doing UX research as a consultant and worked in various, for various companies. I did all sorts of sort of little stints. I did some stuff at Airbnb, but I also did some stuff for a big pharmaceutical company, trying to understand how to help men with prostate cancer seek care earlier. So all sorts of different problems that all came down to, we need to understand the way that people behave and the way that people think, and also that potentially people don't say what they do. There's a kind of you have to see both. that holistic idea of a person as they're going about their life, either using a policy or using a service or using a product, is really central to good design. And design, I mean, in the widest sense, it could be an app, but it could be a new tax paying system. It really could be anything. And so fast forward a little bit, I ended up going and doing a PhD on something completely unrelated to any of this. And fast forward a couple of years, I guess I've now got to a point which for me, I like, where I have my academic side, which is the stuff that I find intellectually really stimulating. And then I also have a slightly more applied / potentially slightly activist side, where I actually get to, as a result, build things for people and see them have some social impact, which is, for me at least, something that I don't feel I get quite so much of from what you might call pure academia. And for me, that balance I really enjoy. And so currently I am leading UX research for a company called Dr. Care Anywhere, which is a healthcare company. And there are lots of different problems that I'm looking at the moment, but one of them, for example, is how to design a mental health care service from scratch. Like, what are all the things that you would want to be a component part if you could start from scratch, if this wasn't the NHS, and if you could just build a mental health care service that could help all sorts of different people that have very different needs, which is a really fundamentally interesting problem. But I also get to do some of the building of it, which is where, as much as I'm interested in research around the panopticon and Foucault in an anthropological setting, I don't get to go and build a mood tracking app, for example, as an anthropologist. So that's kind of, in my mind, where the two link together. I'm going to stop there before I start speaking in a really unstructured way. And Hannah, perhaps you could just ask me a question.
Yeah, sure. I was thinking maybe I should have done this as a kind of an interview with you guys, a bit of pressure to just talk about yourself, kind of. It's a bit like Just a Minute, but it's just a half an hour.
Yeah.
But so I'm kind of, I wonder if it might be interesting for people in the audience to hear a bit.
Oh, Hannah, you're on mute.
Have I been on mute the whole time?
No, you weren't. You just very briefly went on mute.
I don't know quite what happened there. Yeah, so I'm not sure when I went on mute, but anyway, I think that one of the things that might be interesting is to hear a bit about how anthropology, in your experience, is received within the kind of applied world, the UX world. It's like, I think in some respects, I hear that the people are recognizing what anthropology is a bit more, but has that been your experience, or are you feeling that even in that space you're finding people are looking at you with a blank face, not knowing what?
No, not at all, actually. That's such a good question. I'm trying to scan the audience and see if there's anyone I can offend before I answer. I don't know who these people are, so I'm just going to say it. I feel like anthropology is a huge buzzword in the private sector, and it's amazing. I'm not sure if everyone actually knows. That's going to sound really judgmental. I don't know if people actually know what it means in practice necessarily, but I definitely feel like there's a huge interest in it, especially within UX. So most people, like I've actually just gone through I've been looking at CVs because we've been hiring, and most of the people that apply to UX jobs have a background either in anthropology or I guess psychology, or increasingly also HCI, human computer interaction. And that's more in a sort of UX design area potentially. But I think definitely the understanding that people use products, people use services, for it to work well, for it to sell or to help people or whatever the goal is, you have to understand people, and it's complicated and ever changing as well. I think that's something else that I've noticed has changed over the years, that when I first started doing it, that sometimes people would think, okay, we've understood people now, great, we can move on. Whereas now I think increasingly there's a much greater understanding that these things are iterative and constantly evolving, and depending on the sector, of course. But so I work in healthcare now, and especially in healthcare, and especially because of the pandemic and the context of digital health has changed so much in the last 12 months. What people want and need and expect is constantly changing as well. And this idea of sort of virtual therapy and AI therapy, for example, is something that I never thought a year ago I would be looking at, but has suddenly exploded onto the marketplace. And I think there's a really interesting value that anthropologists can add there. Funny enough, just this week, I've been interviewing a load of people about, quote, cultural fit. And a lot of people seeing, for example, for therapy, a barrier of not being able to open up to their therapist because they didn't perceive them to be of, again, quote, cultural fit, and trying to dig into that and understanding what does that actually mean and how could you build a product that could put people at ease and make people feel more comfortable to seek support is actually something that, you know, people increasingly recognize is actually a very niche skill and something that anthropologists are perfectly positioned to speak to.
Great. And then we've got a question from Simon, so I'll bring him in now. I have other questions as well. So, Simon, yeah.
Hi there, Jennifer.
Hi.
I and two other recent master's graduates from the Digital Anthropology course are in the process of launching our own business called the Digital Behaviour Lab, which is a company which helps other companies kind of learn about their staff and customers and navigate change and deliver better performance through the understanding of through human-centered digitally led research. Okay, that's the basic idea. So we're working with UCL on their Build Your Own Business program, and we're getting close to launch now. We've incorporated the company and all that kind of stuff. The thing that we're finding most difficult is that, exactly as you said, that the application of the anthropological method or the viewing of the world through the anthropological lens is not understood in the outside world. And so you find yourself having to translate what you know to be accurate anthropologically into non-anthropological language. And in doing so, we're finding that we're losing the message, if you like, because we're having to, we're being constantly told, don't use the word anthropology, don't say ethnography, don't say because you're pleased. And once you stop saying anthropology or and ethnography or whatever it might be, then you find yourself you stop thinking anthropology and ethnography. And so I wonder how you overcame this idea that you had to, as you say, you had to use different languages, and how you avoid diluting the message or diluting what you're trying to do, or diluting your processing, diluting your thinking, while you're having to adapt your language constantly to an environment full of people who have no understanding of anthropology and who need it to be explained in non-anthropological terms.
Thank you. That's such a good question. So I have to say, I've not particularly had this experience of people sort of responding negatively to the word anthropology or ethnography. I've certainly had sort of polite interest sometimes, as opposed to kind of deep knowledge of it. All I can say is I think I tend to try to work by showing rather than telling. And so something I've been trying to implement a lot in my current job, but I've also done elsewhere, is if people don't understand the theory behind ethnography, sometimes I just show them. Clearly not the entire interview, for example, but we've sort of been experimenting with doing like little video reels, for example, which will be 30 seconds back to back of 7 different people saying a particular thing, and we'll sort of theme them. And so we've been looking at a lot of ways of trying to essentially democratize research so that there's not this sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of stone wall almost, where you have the researcher as the one source of truth between the participants and the stakeholders. That is obviously the way most businesses are structured, and it's what you're there to do. But I've been trying to, I don't know whether this is sort of out of self-defense rather than anything else, kind of open up that wall a bit more so that A, if I take a day off, research doesn't have to stop, which would be lovely. And B, so that I feel like part of what anthropology teaches us is that, is to listen to, how can I phrase this, to profile other voices, right? To profile other stories. And if there's even a way of our sort of traditional concept of going to the field and then coming back doesn't potentially allow for sort of bringing loads of other people into the traditional anthropological book format. And I see the UX world as potentially a bit more flexible in that way, actually, that it's much shorter kind of field work and you're not going off somewhere else, and it's probably just a Zoom call at the moment. And so you can bring other people into it, or if they don't have the time, you can show them a little bit of it. And the other thing I'd say about the translating is, inevitably there are elements of this research of anthropological research that are more interesting or palatable to wider stakeholders than others. So I do not, sadly, go and speak to senior leadership team about Foucault. I would love to do that. It's not what they want, unfortunately. So it's certainly true that a lot of the kind of more theoretical resonances, I'm probably quietly noting down to myself, thinking, oh, I should write about that at some point. And so there is an element of translation, I think, of getting the raw data and translating it into terms that are palatable to them. And so for some people, that might be about profit margin. In healthcare, that's about reducing stigma and helping people to seek support and things like that. And so at the moment, I'm doing a lot of work with sort of surgeons and consultants and doctors. And so they're very interested in people-centric design. They're just not used to anthropological terminology. But I think the end message actually is one that they're completely on board with. It's just a slightly different idiom. So I don't know if I answered your question, other than to say I agree it's difficult. And I suppose at some point you have to slightly I've had to let go of Foucault in some of these meetings. I don't know if that really answers your question.
It's always tempting to want to bring it in to almost to bring it back to theory at some point as well. Just to actually as a point of differentiation in what's becoming quite a crowded market in business anthropology, to say that, you know, you can at some point it might be worthwhile relating it to theory, but yeah, in practice.
Well, yeah, and actually, I suppose it's worth mentioning that I think some people would be interested, you know, and increasingly, I think a lot of UXers also write on Medium about some of these things, and people are interested in some of these theories, and there are a lot of anthropologists in the business who would be really interested in that. I guess, you know, the CFO probably isn't so interested and is ultimately interested in the budget, and I suppose it's just picking your audience. But I certainly wouldn't be I certainly don't silence myself from thinking those things, and I miss being able to, you know, talk in terms of theory all the time. But then I also like being able to see slightly more demonstrable change through product design as well. And I guess that the short version is this is why I do both jobs.
That's a perfect segue into my next question, which was, I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the relationship between the applied work and the academic work, and like how you see that, and whether you see them as complementary or whether you see them as pulling you in two different directions. Because in the discipline, we often hear that applied work is kind of not valued as much, or that, you know, that you can't then publish in the same way. But I'm hearing from you that you've got a kind of more of a positive spin on it. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you've experienced that and navigated it.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, Hannah, it's funny, isn't it? So the last question was sort of about, potentially some people see anthropology could see it, or theory as a negative. I have to say, if anything, I've experienced it the way around. In sort of outside of academia, people overwhelmingly I've found to be really enthusiastic about, and they approach me as this great expert, which I find hilarious. Whereas of course in academia, where we all have imposter syndrome and none of us thinks we could possibly say anything new, it's just a completely different feeling. And so I found that quite surprising at first when I first kind of stepped out of this academic seminar world, where I really kind of didn't feel like my voice mattered very much. And I do still feel like there is, I don't know, there is some kind of stigma, I think, in academia about this sort of slightly somehow less pure, what does somebody call me once? Somebody once called me a grifter, I think that's what it was. And this sort of sense that I somehow hadn't quite made it. And I, you know, sharply reminded them that after 6 months of living without an income at the beginning of COVID, not all of us are able to wait for the perfect academic appointment. And of course, academia has its own very significant hierarchy and pyramid structure, which is very difficult to navigate. And so I do see, this is, you know, my own opinion is I do see the future as increasingly being academics also hopefully wanting to do both. And I do think they can be complementary, I really do. But I do sometimes still feel like I'm slightly alone in saying that. And I do sometimes say in academic circles, I think I've probably even done it here, I've said I'm an applied anthropologist, haven't I? I've probably not. Yeah, I do think there is something within academia sometimes that can be a bit of I don't know the word. I don't know, some people can be a bit sniffy about it, which is a shame, I think, because, you know, I have some friends and colleagues from UCL actually who do this wonderful research with a sort of a branch of activism, which I really admire, but it's not the kind of academic anthropological research that I did. And something I loved my PhD, but there was never really a sort of a so what can I give to society as a result of it? Will anyone ever read the book? I probably won't, and I wrote it, and I do enjoy the fact that, there are some other kind of meatier societal problems, which is something that I like working on and with, that I get to tackle in a very different way in a sort of more applied setting. And I think, I suppose there are areas of anthropology where that's more likely to be complementary. So I know some people who have done research within, for example, migration, who have actually gone over into doing some more applied research on, with sort of either charities or think tanks around immigration and things like that. And then there are some slightly more other areas of anthropological research where it's perhaps slightly harder to see how that might intersect with either the public or the private sector. Yeah, kind of trailed off there, didn't I? That's my answer.
No, that's really great. If anyone else wants to ask Jenny a question, and like anything from really practical things about how did you get into working with the UX sector, or about the RAI, or anything that people want to ask, this is a seminar for you. So do feel confident and put your question in the chat or raise your hand. So we've got Riani's got a question.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Let me turn my video on so you can actually see who you're talking to. Hi. Yeah, sorry if my audio is really bad. My laptop is quite glitchy.
Okay.
But yeah, I wanted to ask about the civil service fast stream. Because I'm thinking of doing the diplomatic branch.
The diplomatic branch, is that, sorry, it broke up slightly. Did you just say you were interested in the diplomatic branch?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was wondering what CV experience you might recommend to collect for that, or just your overall experience, like if you recommend it or not, if I should just focus my energy somewhere else.
Thanks, that's a good question. Gosh, okay, is there anything you can do to prepare for it? Now, forgive me, you should check this with someone else as well. I should caveat all of this by saying that I did this probably 7 or 8 years ago. For all I know, the process may be different. But the one thing I do remember was my overriding memory of working in the civil service is that, and I always found this slightly strange, it's a generalist place. And by that, I mean that you are trained to have experience at doing everything. And I think there are pros and cons to that. But what it means is when it comes to the application, as I remember it, there are essentially admission exams, which was a little bit like kind of maths. And it was kind of, I remember revising GCSE maths for it because I couldn't remember any of it. But they were sort of quite general. And then there was a load of sort of interview task stuff where you had to go in. But I don't think they ever looked at a CV or anything like that. It was very kind of task-based, which is how the civil service works, actually. They have, what do they call it? I've forgotten the word for it now, I'm afraid, but there's this like a particular type of recruitment that they do where it's very kind of based on how you respond to a particular scenario. And as for the civil service in general, I would say it set me off on an incredibly good path, albeit not the path I wanted to be on. But I had to try it to know it wasn't for me. So for me personally, I found it very frustrating that there'd be all sorts of, so the civil service, when you work in the civil service, whichever department, you get all these incredible problems across your desk that for whatever reason, the private sector has not been incentivized to fix, potentially because there isn't a financial bottom line to fixing it. So you do get a lot of fundamentally interesting issues that you get to think about. And it's a very interesting place to work as well. The sort of intersection of that with the political world, which is even more interesting now than it was when I was there, makes it's a very fast-paced, very interesting place, a lot of really intelligent people there. The thing I found very frustrating about it is that, for example, you could work on a project for a month, 3 years, and then it might be that a minister turns around and decides that's not in line with what they want to do anymore, and the whole thing goes. For example, that happened to me in the Department of Health. Or it might be that for whatever reason, you do a load of research and then nothing happens. It's for whatever reason, it's not acted upon. And I found that very, very difficult to work in. It's a very different pace of work, inevitably, because it's, national problems that you're often dealing with. So it's very different, for example, to working in a small tech startup where you might just do a little thing and find it doesn't work and then move on. So it's sort of these big cogs that you have to turn. And the one thing I think I learned about myself by going and doing it was that I didn't want to be a generalist. I wanted to be a specialist. But I did get a lot of skills from it. I had to spend about 3 months in an accountancy department. I think I learned all sorts of things I never thought I would want to learn, which actually have been very valuable in all sorts of other things that I've done in terms of kind of talking to government ministers and briefing people and all sorts. You get a lot of confidence and you get a lot of exposure to a lot of different things. So I recommend it, albeit if it wasn't in the end the right thing for me. I don't know how helpful that is, but good luck.
On that,
that's great, thank you.
On that point about skills, like if people are interested in, we were talking before about UX and being an anthropologist in that area, and from talking to lots of people who have done degrees in anthropology, they often kind of train themselves in something else as well, and it's a combination of different skills that take them to where they want to be. And I wonder in the UX area if there's specific skills that are complementary that anthropology students might want to think about, like training themselves in to be able to move into that area.
Definitely. And I'm really glad you asked me that, because this is actually something I've seen a lot, even recently, where I've been looking at people's CVs who've been applying. And obviously the sort of academic background in anthropology or something like psychology or whatever is really, really great. But you do also need to be able to demonstrate that you can apply those skills that you've learned in a slightly different setting. And if you don't have any direct experience already, nowadays there's a ton of training online. Udemy, UDEMY, but also .com, I think, and then FutureLearn. There's a ton of UX training materials, and I can send some stuff to Hannah and she can share if people want this stuff. Some of it's free. There are also short courses. There are also, master's courses for people who really want to look at it. But definitely, the principles of anthropology, I think, can be extended a bit more into a design context by learning a bit about UX design, and then also how product development works. So in a lot of places, digital product development follows something called Agile Methodology, which is essentially the way that you design, research, chuck out, try again. And this is sort of a way, it's a method, it's a way in which a lot of companies work, which for a lot of academics is absolutely not how we work. We go off and we spend 3 years researching a problem and then write a really long thing. And that is not, generally speaking, helpful in a business scenario. People do not want an essay. People are not going to read the essay. And so learning other ways of communicating research findings and how to work with people who are not academics, but are maybe designers or developers, is definitely a really, really valuable thing. And there's a ton of stuff online that you can do that I think a lot of it's even free. So that's where I'd recommend you start.
Okay, that's really helpful, having something kind of a tangible place to go to explore. So we have another question from Simon. Simon, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. How did you get into your UX gigs? Maybe you explain, or maybe, I'm not sure if I missed it. How did you? I mean, it was a while ago now, but how did you get into UX? What was the path you took? How did you find out about these jobs, etc.? I mean, is it easy to do?
That's a really good question, and as I think probably most people, it was by mistake. Honestly, it was when I was in the civil service actually, and I got sent to the Department of Health to implement what they were calling a digital strategy. And while I was there, I started speaking to some of the developers. And I basically got chatting to, in government, they have civil servants, and then they have a lot of consultants. And I found out that these consultants were on at least 5 times the amount of money I was on. And I realized that we had the same qualifications and we were doing the same thing. And I was so angry when I found that out. I just thought, right, I'm going to go and just rewrite my CV. I'm just going to rebrand myself. And I did. So I started off doing UX research, but as a civil servant. And this was just chance, really, that I kind of got put into this role. I think somebody left, realized that this actually was really similar in many ways to some of the anthropology that I'd already done as a master's student. And then I don't, people talk about having this weird light bulb moment, but I was in Japan. I remember that vividly. And I remember just suddenly realizing that I could just quit my job as a civil servant and just set up my own company. And worst case scenario, if it completely failed, if I'd only managed to get 2 weeks of work, I would still have broken even for the year. And this was in March. And I realized that the amount I could charge as a day rate consultant would be enough. If I did 2 weeks of work for the rest of the year, it would be the same amount of money. So I just thought, right, I have nothing to lose, I'm going to try it. Yeah. And I did. And I got a 6-month contract, and then I ended up getting another 6-month contract. And in the end, when you've built up even a little bit of experience, actually, LinkedIn is full of headhunters. And I've never looked for any of the work that I've done. I've just always had random headhunters find me on LinkedIn. And to the extent actually that, and this is purely personal to me, my own rule for this stuff is that I only take work that I actually feel really, motivated by. And so I get quite a lot of emails from, for example, I got one of the week from a headhunter working for Lloyd's, and they wanted something, it was a finance thing. I got another one last week that was from a gambling company that wanted to gamify gambling. I'm not at all interested in applying my dubious skills, whatever they may be, to that problem. And so I that for me is the rule. And so I only respond to things that I actually care about. So I've worked in education and healthcare and diplomacy. But that all of that is to say that it was essentially chance. I kind of learned a bit of it on the job. I learned all that stuff about like agile product development, all that language, if you like. Yeah. I kind of learned by mistake because I was sitting around some people like that. And I have to say, I kind of at the very beginning approached it. So my undergrad was in languages. I used to work as a translator, and I literally just considered it as a translation exercise that I had to just learn that rather than using the word epistemological or whatever, I just had to insert this other word here. And once I got my head around that and understood how to speak to these people, which is a big part of working in government anyway, actually, whether you're speaking to an accountant or a diplomat, you have to just learn to speak in these different worlds.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're finding. If we have to talk to C-suites kind of people, then the language we have to use is entirely different. It might say the same thing, entirely different. But I
almost look at it as a drag and drop exercise, and I just have to gear change sometimes slightly and remember who I'm talking to. But it's I think
it is interesting that you said something about earlier on about anthropology being a bit of a buzzword, and I'm hearing a lot of people say they want it, say they understand it, say they need it, but actually don't understand what on earth it is at all. So there's an educational process that you have to go through without being pedagogic about it at all. You know, I'm not teaching you something, but you clearly need to understand this before we can move forward, because they like the idea of it, and somebody has mentioned it somewhere at a board meeting. And now everybody's an expert. And
I definitely get that a lot, but actually I have to say it's also equally true if you put the word UX in there. I've done a lot of things before where a lot of companies think they want UX, they want user insight, and then when you actually tell them what users think, they're like, oh, that's not what we wanted to do. You asked for the research, I've given you the findings. Whether or not you do anything with it is kind of up to you. And that is a whole different exercise and sort of evangelizing, if you like, the need for research and evidence-based strategy and decision making is a constant, I think, in I'm sure more sectors than just these, but that's my bread and butter, I'm afraid.
That's my experience too.
Great. Rosalie's got a quick follow-up question about UX, so do you want to ask Rosalie?
Hi, Jenny. So just to stay on that topic, I'm just thinking about the students in the department, the kinds of questions they've got. For students who are just graduating, do you have any specific advice about how they would enter UX in terms of internship opportunities, for example, things like that?
I can't speak about internships, partly because I've always made a really big stand about not bringing in people unpaid or unlimited money. And so I've made an effort never to do internships, which maybe is not what people want to hear. But I think that UX is specialist enough that you shouldn't have to do an internship. Like personally, I think that by the time you have some of these skills, you should be charging money for them. And I really believe that. But in terms of getting your CV to a point where you can get a foot in the door, if you've got a degree in anthropology, I would say especially if you have a master's degree, but I don't think you have to have a master's necessarily. I would recommend going and doing, in the first instance, just a couple of short online courses about UX. And I can have a look. I'm actually looking at this anyway for something else, so I can have a look and I can send some stuff through to Hannah. There are some free ones. There are also, you know, I can't remember exactly how Future Learn works, but some of them might need to pay something. I think that's a good start, and it would give you a bit of a sense of how to translate your existing skill set into a slightly different world. If you're interested more in the design element of things, there are short, not even, well, they're master's degrees, but they're sort of, you can do them remotely and things. There's a ton of stuff out there. And so if this is really something you think you wanted to do, then I'd suggest like a little bit of doing something like that. And the reason I mention that is I know that some of those master's courses have a lot of practical portfolio building stuff, and especially on the design side of things. So a lot of researchers also do some of the UX design. You do need to start trying to build up a portfolio, which is obviously a bit of a harder thing. I would never expect a researcher, and this is just me personally, to show me a portfolio. That's more on the design side of things. So in the first instance, I would try doing some of those online courses. LinkedIn even has some. And I would also suggest, and this is such like cynical advice, get on LinkedIn, put all these buzzwords on there with a hashtag, like user-centric design, user-centered research, ethnographic, all of those things, because headhunters search by hashtags and they look at those things, they do.
UCL also has like a subscription to LinkedIn Learning, which is like a repository of like loads and loads of short courses. So whilst people are registered as students here, definitely have a look at that, because that's a really great resource if you want to do some of these kinds of courses.
And put them on your CV. That's the other thing I was just going to mention. Like, put them on your CV, because I have to say I've looked at a lot of CVs recently where I see they've done, you know, anthropology or something really, really relevant. But then I'm also, you know, when in comparison with somebody else that has a thing of experience on their CV that has the word UX in it, that actually has that explicit word, if I'm sifting through a load of CVs and I don't see that word, and there's like 30 people that I'm looking at, that does actually become quite important. So just sort of tailoring what you put on your CV, which is a slightly different topic, but yeah, sort of, I'm sure that career services can advise on that as well.
Great, but we've got a couple of hands up, so we'll go to Joe next.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this earlier. I had a question about kind of getting buy-in once you've done this like research, kind of whether it's similar, I guess, to academic strategies, or where you've kind of pulled those skills from in order to get like C-suite or, you know, really anyone to believe in the value of user research.
Yeah, actually, I would say that that's a really good question, because in my experience, that is where it's very different to in you know, academia, for example. I mean, you can go to a conference and obviously give an academic paper where you're discussing kind of a really interesting idea, and that in and of itself is really valuable as a contribution to knowledge. That is, in my experience at least, that is what is very different in the outside of academia, where there's also a so what. So great, we have some knowledge now, but it needs to be actionable in some way, and it needs to ultimately either convert into something to do with product design or understanding our users better, or there needs to be a sort of a next step. Some people would argue that's true in academia as well, of course, but that to me is a very big distinction. And in terms of demonstrating that value, as I already mentioned, I mean, my own way of doing this is always to try and actually just bring people into research. I really believe that empathy is a huge thing of this. You know, recently I kind of tried to bring in a load of our developers and product managers into watching some interviews that we were doing with people who had been seeking mental health support. And actually watching somebody talk about the difficulties of trying to get therapy in the middle of a pandemic is a very different experience to hearing me telling them that it was difficult. And I don't think there's a shorthand for that. Like just actually seeing it. I don't think anybody that had sat in that session would then deny the need to make something work for users. I'm trying to remember the other thing I was going to mention, sorry. It will come back to me. I don't know how much I answered your question, but something just escaped my mind. But I think the main thing is being ethnographic, which is what we would, as anthropologists would call it, evidence-based. That's what we're there to do. Occasionally I've been in rooms where I have been sort of hammering out that this is not what users want and need. And in the end, somebody far more important than me has said yes, but the credit card says no, at which point I have to stop fighting. But I've always considered myself to be in that room, whatever that room is, to represent the people, the end users of, you know, the product or service or policy. And that, yeah, that's where the kind of buck stops for me, really, I think.
There's a comment in the chat from Anya where she's talking about this kind of presenting your CV and your skills, and she said from her experience you need case studies as a youth researcher, even if you don't have a full portfolio, but you can use university projects. And maybe that relates as well to what you're just saying there, that your university projects can also be a demonstration of those kinds of skills around empathy and listening and understanding people's perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. And for people that don't know, Anya is also like a super duper senior user researcher person.
Yeah, so, Anya, if you want to come in and like articulate your
but yes, I definitely think like the ability to tell a story, which is central to anthropology and to being a good researcher, and is also central to doing well at a job interview. Right, being able to actually give a scenario. This was the scenario. This is what happened. This is what the research was. As a result of that, we implemented this. You know, it sounds quite obvious, but actually a lot of people can't do that. I've certainly found an interview.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just want to say, I really think it's important to have a portfolio. So I disagree with Jennifer on that. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't need to look like a designer's portfolio because nobody really expects that from you. But I think to tell a story about where you did something that might be relevant to the company that you're working for, or something that shows the process of your thinking and your work, I think is definitely absolutely crucial. I would, like, every time I get a CV that doesn't have a portfolio, I'd be like, where's the CV? I'll ask people, and mostly then they present in the job interview a case study, and that's fine. But I would definitely be prepared for that.
Great, thanks. And if students wanted to know how to put together a portfolio, are there places they could go for templates or for understanding what a portfolio would look like? Because it's not something that we would be teaching our students, and there's lots of sessions we run in careers about kind of building a CV and writing a covering letter, but we don't cover making a portfolio. So either.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely, loads. I mean, you just have to Google it.
Do a Google search. Yeah,
there's a guy who's a UX. I think he's maybe a UX designer called Ian Fenn, and I think he even like looks through your portfolio and makes recommendations if you already have one. But he also has lots of information online that you could look through.
Great, that's really helpful.
I mean, another thing you can try is I know some people kind of mentor, and you can, but if you especially if you know somebody that maybe works in this area, you can always approach somebody and sort of very gently and friendly say, well, would you mind kind of coaching me a little bit? They might not say yes, but I do know quite a lot of senior product people do that as part of their own development, so you can always ask.
Yeah, I think that's, and UCL actually has a mentorship scheme as well through the careers service. I don't know whether there's UX researchers who are listed on there, but that's also something that people could look at. Who knows? So Lydia, you've had your hand up for ages. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I wanted to ask you more about illustration for anthropological research. I had heard your Being Human podcast a while back, so I'm aware about all the benefits and how it's been used so far. But I was wondering whether you've used it at all, or considering to do so? And how can we also access the exhibition you co-curated? Is it online?
It is online. I'm so glad you asked me that. The physical thing is currently underneath my sofa, because it was up in Liverpool, and then it's going to be in Sheffield, but COVID says no. So we don't know when that will be exactly. There is an online exhibition. It's illustratinganthropology.com, I think. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it is. It's all on there. And my colleague Laura is actually in the process of also doing some sort of teaching packs, which I think Adam Drazen in the department, along with various other people actually around the world, interestingly, are going to start using a bit as well for some of the more visual anthropology stuff. So the kind of concept behind it really was that obviously the main anthropological formats, especially when it comes to publishing further down the line, are books and journal articles, and often are not very visual. Increasingly, some journals let you have maybe 5 images, but it's such a written format, and we just really felt that there was just so much knowledge that can't be conveyed that way. Speaking just from my own experience, all of my PhD fieldwork was in Cuba, and I had this experience. I arrived in the field, and because Cuba was, this is a bit, was and potentially is a dictatorship, that's a very a large other side track, a lot of people communicate using essentially a sign language, which I had to learn. And so I had this experience of arriving in the field, and people kept talking, doing all these weird things, and I just had no idea what was going on. It took me a long time to actually learn what that all meant. And then I couldn't really convey that very well in anthropological writing. And so I started drawing people's hands more as a for myself, something else, like a sort of dictionary for myself. And Laura, whose fieldwork is in Japan, similarly does a lot of sketching and illustration as a way of partly recording knowledge, but also partly as a way of actually working with her research participants in a far more sort of democratic way. And we had a load of people that put stuff into the exhibition where they had been doing research, potentially with, for example, communities who'd been subject to violence, or for example, healthcare issues where they maybe weren't very comfortable talking, but they were very comfortable or more comfortable kind of discussing their experiences through drawing. And it was almost quite therapeutic for some of them. And so basically, go and check it out. It's sort of organized, the actual physical exhibition was organized into 5 sections according to what we thought the value to anthropology could be of an illustrative form. And there's some map makings, there's maps in there, there's some kinship diagrams in there, there's a lot of incredible kind of watercolors and sketches, there's a lot of cartoon strips, approaching some kind of massively difficult issues like death and bereavement, but through comic form. And there's all sorts in there. And we are sort of discussing with a publisher, getting a sort of a book project from it as well. So watch this space. And then in terms of the podcast, the output for that, so far it will carry on as it is. I did do a program on Radio 3 a couple of months back, which was as a result of some of that, because I think it's interesting how I started putting this stuff out there into the more public sphere, like illustration and podcasts, and suddenly a completely different audience emerged. And somebody from the BBC just contacted me saying, oh, we think this is really interesting. I was like, well, great, I agree. Actually, everything that a lot of anthropologists do is really interesting. It's just that they're not reading the journal articles because they're very time poor. So I'm hoping to try and get a bit more sort of wider media coverage for some of that work as well in due course, if I ever find time.
So basically, illustration comes both from the people you're doing your research on, yourself, or you can also cooperate with an actual illustrator and create content.
Yeah, so if you go and have a look on there, each anthropologist has a page, but they've written a sort of a little section explaining kind of what illustration meant to their method. And in some cases, it was actually their participants that did the drawing and they're credited there. Or in some cases, it was more of a collaborative thing. I'll give you another example of an anthropologist, I think he's at Bristol, who does a lot of work with an indigenous group in Panama. And they wanted an opportunity to represent themselves in the way that they see themselves, as opposed to the way that tourists see them. And so they actually designed this long comic about their own culture as a way of writing it down. And it was just the anthropologist essentially facilitated publishing it as a sort of a source of the truth, but according to them. And we thought that was a really powerful thing that anthropologists can do, as opposed to this sort of slightly older fashioned idea of going to the field, taking all of the knowledge and then buggering off, basically. And so this was sort of a more reciprocal, creative way, which there's several different instances of that. And yeah, there's a sort of text about each one, which sort of explains some of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. I'm glad you brought it back to that, because I did also just want to ask a question about that public anthropology role. I'm really interested in this challenge of why is it that anthropology is not known as a discipline? What is it that we're not doing that means that it's not in the public domain? And how does one change that? In a way, it's been a long-running conversation. So I wondered from your kind of experiences of being given this role, you and Laura, as kind of public anthropology fellows, what you see as the reasons why at the moment there isn't a bigger role for anthropology in the public domain, and how we might go about improving that. It's obviously a big question. There's lots of, you're doing great things, and I think these exhibitions and the podcasts are really good examples, but presumably there's much more that could be done. And I wondered from your perspective what that would look like, or who needs to be doing it.
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't think I have a wonderful answer. I have to say, one thing that I've experienced in the last year or two of trying to sort of herd together anthropology, because obviously I've not done all this, I've just been herding and profiling other anthropologists' voices, right? That, it's other anthropologists who have done a load of really important research. But one thing I have found is that I think there's a lot of caution, particularly in anthropologists, this is just my own experience, of being almost anxious of saying anything that's outside of the very narrow remit of the particular research they've done. And I completely understand that as well. I'm very nervous speaking about Cuba in general. I don't know about Cuba in general. I know about a very particular thing in Cuba. But of course, if you then take that into, a BBC scenario or a journalism scenario, they might not want a comment on the very, very, very specific thing you've done. They actually just want a comment on, Cuba, or potentially not even Cuba, potentially something about a similar issue, but on the other side of the world. I found when I went onto this BBC show, as an example, they didn't tell me at all what the radio program was about, at all. I arrived at the BBC and I had no idea what I was going to talk about. And I got into the booth thinking, okay, well, somebody will brief me. No, the green light went on and I just was there waiting for a question and had no idea what was coming. And the first question that came was about Japan. And obviously inside my head, all sorts of swearing was going on. I was thinking, Jesus, I know nothing about Japan. And I think the difficulty is that as soon as you leave the sort of academic world where it's acceptable, for example, in a conference to say, I'm going to defer to my colleague on this because I don't know about this specific thing and that was not in the remit of my research. That's kind of not how it goes in, on the radio or whatever. And when I listen to, for example, historians or economists speaking on the news, they're often seemingly more comfortable at sort of just giving large conclusions about mankind, which is something I feel like we all really shy away from. I don't know what the answer is there, but it's just something I've observed, even just trying to get anthropologists to speak publicly over the last year, that I've had to do quite a lot of, I don't know what the right word would be, not hand holding, but sort of, calming, because people are very anxious about being shot down, often by another anthropologist, for having spoken out of turn. I think that's the problem. I don't really know what the answer is, but I do think that's a real challenge. And I also just think often in academia there's a sort of a hierarchy of knowledge where you sort of feel quite scared sometimes to say. I mean, even in seminar settings, right? Hopefully not in this one, but in some people feel really nervous about asking a question, and that's not necessarily kind of conducive to then going and evangelizing and waxing lyrical about anthropology this and anthropology that. The only other small point I would just say, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about UX, is I try and work the word anthropology in any given opportunity. And I just do that all the time. And I suppose if we all did that, maybe we would. I'm sure there are lots of anthropologists that do all sorts of public things, but maybe they just don't call themselves that. I don't know.
I was going to ask if you said at the beginning that the RAI wanted like a David Attenborough of anthropology, and maybe you don't feel you're that, but are there people in the discipline who you think are kind of stepping into that kind of role, or is a problem that we don't really like? Who would be the public anthropologists of our kind of
I probably would have, yeah, I probably would have said David Graeber, actually. Because I think he was very successful at speaking about really big ideas in a way that really galvanized a lot of people. Of course, you know, very political set of ideas. So, and in his own way, obviously, Danny Miller has done this a lot as well, about more sort of, you know, social media type stuff. I'm trying to think as well. Yeah, I'm sure there are other names and they're just not coming to me right now. But I suppose the point is I am also having to think about the question. There's not like an immediate David Attenborough. I suppose people aren't as cute as animals, so David Attenborough had a slightly easier job there. But
although his early documentaries were very anthropological, actually, as much about the people as they were about animals.
No, I know. I mean, actually, the other interesting thing is that the one bit of, I mean, if we're talking about like TV, the one bit of anthropology that does seem to really grab, you know, public attention is more forensic anthropology. And actually, you know, that does, and whenever I hear the word anthropologist on TV, it always seems to be followed by some bones. So, you know, maybe we just need to kind of expand on that slightly. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, that's always perplexed me as well, because in the discipline of anthropology, that's not what people...
I don't know where these people are. Yeah, I know.
So yeah. Simon's got his hand up, I think, wants to ask a question.
Yeah, just a comment really, that in my experience after leaving UCL, it's easy for us to forget actually how much we know and the body of knowledge that we hold and how valuable it can be to other people. And I think that if we're you know, shy about expressing ourselves and worried about treading on toes and upsetting you know, academic hierarchies and whatever, we won't get the message across. But actually, as you said, people are very, very interested in what we talk about. If we modify the language so it's not too technical for them, I'm finding that people are really, really interested in it. We've got a lot to say. We know an awful amount, a huge amount about a very interesting subject, you know, what it is to be human in human society. And that we have a huge amount to contribute to public discourse on all sorts of subjects, because it all comes down to understanding the human experience. And I think that we should not forget that. We should not forget how much we know and how much potentially we can contribute. But it is difficult to break free of the shackles which we are bound through our academic experience. But I think that we have there's an awful lot that we can do, whether as individual Attenboroughs or not. We can contribute, I think, massively to society. And I think we just have to work out, and you know, maybe there are institutions in place that allow us to do that, or maybe we do it on an individual level, you know, as we pursue our own careers. But we've got a lot to say.
And there definitely are anthropologists that are saying some of these things. Possibly not. I mean, possibly not. You know, from the BBC, that's not the only source of doing it. I know anthropologists have gone into working in think tanks, you know, looking at things like climate change and the rise of the right wing, or, you know, authoritarian politics. And I remember about a year ago trying to think about what topics. So when I was planning the podcast, I did it sort of back to front, and I was thinking what topics in the world right now might be really interesting from an anthropological perspective, rather than what anthropologists do I think should speak to the public. And then I got the topic and I tried to find anthropologists that could all bring a really different lens onto this topic. So, you know, we were looking at kind of social distancing, but not just in a COVID context. But what does sociality mean? What does it mean to be distanced from people you care about? You know, from a human perspective was the first one. And then, you know, we did kind of what does it mean to care, to provide care? And this was sort of in line with some stuff happening at the time about carers in the UK. But also things like climate. There's a lot of issues where, aside from the, you know, quote, harder science, either medical or kind of climate science side of things, there's I'm talking to Hannah, who's literally written the book on the subject. There's a lot of social elements to it that clearly is really important knowledge. So I suppose maybe anthropologists aren't quite so loud, but I do encounter anthropologists actually all the time. So on some level, I think I'm getting through. It's presenting it as a bit of a war, isn't it? Which I don't think is the right way of looking at it. But
it's also perhaps our time, in that there's so much, societies are under such stress at the moment because of particular circumstances at the moment, that there's an awful lot to explore and an awful lot that we can add to the discussion. I mean, even as you some of the examples you gave there, but also people working from home. What is how is that affecting sociality? How is are you working from home or are you living at work? And all those kind of questions, and those are particularly relevant now, and it's right in our field, and we have an awful lot that we can say about that we can examine and present about that. So I think the time is right for us, to be honest.
Raw.
I
agree.
So maybe just to wrap up then, if there are students out there who are also interested in public anthropology and getting involved in these kinds of activities, have you come across anything that is sort of that students could be involved in around things to do like the RAI or the podcasting or that side of your work?
Yeah. If people want to develop experience running a podcast, get in touch with me. I need help, guys, please. I would love for someone to get in touch with me about that. And I think, on the illustration side, actually, as a genuine note, if anyone in the room does consider themselves a bit of an illustrator or whatever, then do get in touch with Laura. I think initiatives like that, I just think the more the merrier. There's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, I think, also to challenge some of the slightly more rigid kind of anthropological publishing format. So Hannah, which we've had discussions about entanglements, for example, which is a sort of a online space where there's some slightly more kind of fluid genres of work coming out. And I know that, there's a lot of, cultural anthropology as well has like a sort of slightly more blog type space. There are, I think, efforts to, to incorporate knowledge outside of the 8,000 word journal article. Oh, sorry, turn my video off. I'm back. I'm still here. So I guess I would encourage people to continue to contribute to things like that. And, I don't quite know who the whole audience is, but even at undergrad level, kind of doing a blog or podcast is, I think, a very accessible way of sharing research. And the one thing I would also add is, as you sort of get slightly further up the academic chain, there is an increasing onus on researchers to prove research impact. And that's often enumerated as a metric. And so actually, to be really cynical about it, contributing to things like a podcast or an exhibition is also quite beneficial to your career as an academic researcher. So even if nobody here wants to go into UX or whatever, and you want to stay in anthropology, great, you should still do this.
And just lastly, but with the RAI, what have you come to the end of your term as was it a set period of time, or is it going off into the future?
I don't know either. We have asked.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think they are still trying to decide whether they want to what they want to happen. And so, as far as I know, in the meantime, we're just sort of floating along, carrying on, and we've asked for some budget to continue some of the obviously things like podcasts would hopefully be an ongoing project. So watch this space.
Yeah, I was asking the question not to close down the great work that you were doing, but more to say what's next, what are the plans that the RAI have for public anthropology in the pipeline?
Yes, I would like to be able to answer that question.
Yeah, fair enough. Anna's also made a really good point in the chat, but for students who want to start to be talking a bit more publicly about the things that they've been studying or dissertations or things that you've been involved in, the Anthropolitan is also a great place to start writing about anthropology, and that's circulated now through the links in the newsletter to quite a big audience. So that's a really good point as well. So is there anything else you want to add, Jenny? You've given us a great insight into lots of different things that you've been doing.
Thank you. I don't think there's anything else I'd like to add, but I'm very, very happy for people to contact me if they have any specific questions they feel I would be able to help with, either directly or potentially if you have other questions and for whatever reason you were terrified to speak on this call because I'm scary, that's fine. Send your questions to, I don't know whether it should be Hannah or Rosalie or Anna, but somebody, and I would be very glad to respond to them.
Yeah, you can send it to any of us and we'll get it to Jenny.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about all your experiences. I think that was super helpful and lots of really practical tips, as well as like bigger kind of questions about what anthropology is and who it's for. So that's fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you for everybody for showing up.
Yeah,
this is like way more people than would be in a physical room, right?
I know, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it got up to like 60 people, so that's really good. And yeah, if we could like do a little virtual round of applause.
I am sad that's in the department, but
I know.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you for having me.
No, thank you for giving a great talk. Okay, fantastic. Lots of thanks in the chat.
Everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.